Good morning from New York. I'm Chris Hayes, here with MSNBC contributor Goldie Taylor, Ovik Roy, former advisor to Mitt Romney on healthcare, Ta-Nehisi Coates from The Atlantic magazine, and Lorella Praeli of the United We Dream Network. And we are talking about the demographic structure of Tuesday night's victory for the president and the two coalitions in American life, and the ways in which senses of multiculturalism, cosmopolitanism on one side, and senses of grievance, persecution, endangeredness for the white majority on the other side seem to be some of the subtexts of what happened both on Tuesday night and the reaction to it. And I just gave a little bit of data about Latinos who are generally pretty Democratic voting and pretty liberal in the polling. And Goldie, you wanted to say something.
I think that African Americans and Latinos alike report more frequent church attendance than any of the demographics in this country. Yeah. They are largely socially conservative. I think where social conservatives, evangelicals, white evangelicals get it wrong is try to attach their politics in that way. African Americans and Latinos don't take their faith beyond their front yard. Mm-hmm. They don't take it into the voting booth, never have. And so if you find a white evangelical running in Georgia who is trying to get more of the black vote based on being pro-life or anti-gay marriage, you know, those are not functional bonds to make, because I am far less likely to take my faith to my neighbor's house or into the voting booth.
Let me also say, though, ideology that people have isn't something just out there or just internal to them. It is formed through the experience of coalition. I mean, this is actually one of the remarkable things, right, is that you get into coalitions with people, then you start spending time around them, and it changes how people think about stuff. And I think that's one of the things we've seen. There's been, I think, probably too much made of African Americans and gay marriage, and African Americans don't like gays, and they're the reason that Prop A passed in California. And what we've seen is the coalition that is essentially the progressive coalition, the Democratic coalition, which has both gay people and African Americans, the majority of both.
And African American gay people.
And African American gay people, because you can be both, it turns out. I think that coalition, the politics of working together, has changed opinion.
Yeah, and I think, this is why, at the beginning I was most happy about marriage equality, but, that's me speaking as a liberal, right? Just getting back to this question that you said about, is this good for the country overall? I know plenty of African Americans. I think, some of us have family members. You want to get into a debate about welfare, you can really do it. Now, you want to get into a debate about taxes, you can really do it. I oppose.
You want to get into a debate about drug legalization?
Yes, you can.
Really do it.
You can really do it. Yeah. You can really, really do it. Look, I oppose those people as a liberal, right? And I hope that they never garner any degree of power in the political system, but they deserve to be represented.
Right.
And I think that's the great tragedy. When you talk about what's happening in terms of the racialization of the Republican Party, they deserve to be represented. This deserves to be a fight.
Right.
And what you end up with is, in effect, folks voting, a certain way because somebody else is telling them they don't want them.
And I think that ends up, that's why the politics break down. And I'm glad to see that this has transferred to this immigration discussion. But just if I can, and Lorella, I want to get your response to this. If I were strictly an amoral political consultant right now to the Republican Party, I think comprehensive immigration reform is both good policy, good for the country, and morally the right thing to do. Mm-hmm. But if I were just a total Machiavellian political consultant in the Republican Party, I think you're right. I don't think it's going to win them any Republican votes. I genuinely don't think it will. And I think it won't, because I think if a Democratic president and a Republican Congress put it together, people are going to remember one side of that equation. I'm sorry, no one's going to be like, thank God for the Republican Congress making this happen, A. And B, if you give a path to citizenship for 12 million people, they're going to be Democratic voters. I mean, so the arguments, the political arguments against it, and again, I am not ratifying these arguments as substantively right, but the political arguments against it, they seem pretty strong.
But it's the way it begins to change the conversation. And so it's like President Obama had not delivered on anything until DACA, right? And we forced him to do that. There was a tremendous amount of pressure that went into making that
DACA is the
happen.
deferred action.
The deferred action for childhood arrivals. He had to show that he was in it for more, that his words were followed by actions.
Right.
And I think that's where the Republican Party could make a difference in terms of immigration. It is in doing more than just saying, I want Latinos to come and join me. I want them to be a part of my base. I want to develop relationships with them. Right. You have to do something to show them that.
And so that you're saying that it's a threshold step that then can inaugurate another trajectory of the politics, even if it itself isn't the thing that, oh, look, now we're going to be...
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Democrats worked on this, 40 years, 50 years? How long has the Democratic Party been trying to get this right? I mean, this is,
You're saying specifically with immigration or with...
I'm saying this idea of a broad coalition, regardless of... They've been working on this since, 48? I mean, you can really...
That's true.
It takes a long time.
That's true.
And go back... do it with one policy.
That's right. And go back about how Roosevelt basically sold out African Americans in the New Deal, up and down, to how JFK had to fight his own... I mean, that's a long story.
I just want to bring up one point about this Obama executive order, which is, and you covered this on your show, Marco Rubio was working on...
Not an executive order, just so we're clear.
Sorry.
Prosecutorial discretion, just as a legal matter.
Pardon me. Marco Rubio was working on a Republican version of the DREAM Act, which Mitt Romney was basically making noises about endorsing in his campaign. Obama saw this and preempted them with this prosecutorial discretion. So I mean, it's important also to know that, it was brilliant politically and tactically, but it's not like Republicans were just ignoring the issue. Marco Rubio was really trying to lead the front on this, and he was blunted.
You were there. You were in the meetings with Marco Rubio.
I met with Senator Rubio. We commended him for taking the step to have the conversation. We never saw a bill. We don't know what that bill would have looked like right now. And they were compromising on something that I think we are not willing to compromise on, and that is a pathway to citizenship. We have grown up in this country. Right. We are part of the social fabric in America, and they're telling us, here, we're going to give you something. You can have legal status, but you will forever be a part of the second class, the underclass. And, I think going forward, whatever conversation Democrats and Republicans engage in with regards to an immigration policy for this country, we'll have to have a pathway to citizenship.
But here's one point that I think is important, which is that moment with Rubio, and I think that was from a political perspective, everything was fascinating about the whole moment. It was fascinating that you guys, and I mean the Dreamers, who I have a tremendous admiration for, as you know, I nominated you for an award yesterday, the Dreamers they were not partisan. They were like, you know what? I don't care if it's an election year and Democratic President Obama. We're going to go protest outside OFA offices, and you put pressure on him. And I think this speaks to this idea of what is lost when the two parties aren't competing. It was the moment of competition when Rubio entered the fray, when people were competing for those votes, that produced the trigger that made the deferred action happen.
Yes. And it won't be, it won't be enough that President Obama has said he is committed to passing an immigration reform bill in his second term. That's not enough. Like we will fight for that to make that happen. We will engage with the Republican Party, with the Democratic Party, and that is because we're not loyal to the Democrats or to the Republicans, and I can't emphasize that enough. Because I think it's important. Like the beautiful part about America, from where I stand right now, is that I do not have the right to vote in this country, but I can have my voice heard. I can influence people. I can move people, and I can organize people. The DREAM Act was first introduced in 2001. Right. 2001, and it's been that long and it hasn't moved, right? It came very close in 2010. I think that was a great victory for our movement, but I think we have a long way to go.
Yeah. And I think the other part of this, in terms of is it just some policy spigot that you could turn on and the bucket fills up with electoral votes? But the other part of this, and we shouldn't ignore, is just that white voters are not monolithic either, right? I mean, it wasn't Mitt Romney won the white vote, but here there's Barack Obama won single white women, postgraduate, union households, LGBT, white residents of cities over 500,000, whites who never attend religious service voted for Barack Obama 57 to 39, 71% of Jewish voters, 61% non-Judeo-Christian whites voted for Barack Obama. So, these coalitions, part of me thinks that I was thinking about this. We only have the exit polling we have, and the categories in the exit polling are essentially racial categories largely, and then there's also things married, religious status. But you wonder if it was who watches The Voice and who watches American Idol, or it would be fascinating if you just had some totally other set of categories.
And download the Obama database for that.
That's exactly right. If you had some other set of categories, are there all sorts of other subterranean coalitions that are actually happening that we're not looking at? Because the categories we're looking at are these sort of census categories. MSNBC contributor Goldie Taylor, former Mitt Romney healthcare advisor Ovik Roy, Ta-Nehisi Coates from Atlantic Magazine, and Lorella Prowley of the United We Dream Network. That was just a fantastic conversation. I really learned a lot from all of you. Thank you for having me. When it came to the process of actually voting, this election was a national disgrace. That's next. All right, the Supreme Court of the United States yesterday agreed to hear a challenge to a key part of the landmark Voting Rights Act passed in 1965 at the height of the Civil Rights Movement, setting up what likely will be a contentious battle over the future of voting in this country in the near future. We're supposed to feel very good about voting. But even if you celebrated President Obama's victory on Tuesday night, you cannot possibly feel good about people waiting 3, 4, even 5 hours to exercise their right to vote. It's a spectacle so embarrassing that the president himself couldn't help but note it just 2 minutes into his big victory speech.
I want to thank every American who participated in this election. Whether you voted for the very first time or waited in line for a very long time. By the way, we have to fix that.
I love that flare in his eyes of genuine anger at that statement. The incredible irony here is that when the president was making that reference to long voting lines, many people across the country were still waiting in them. Take, for instance, the story from Wednesday's Miami Herald. Alfie Fernandez waited 3 hours at an early voting place on Saturday before she had to take her daughter to an activity. She waited another 2 hours Tuesday morning before leaving to take care of her children while her husband went to work. Shortly before 7 p.m. Tuesday, she returned to the polling place for a third time. She cast her vote after midnight. Although Fernandez knew the projected results by the time she voted, she wanted to vote for President Obama. In the wake of the last Florida voting debacle, we had resolved to make things better. In 2002, Congress passed the Help America Vote Act, or HAVA, which allocated almost $4 billion to states to help them make sweeping reforms to the voting process. And yet reports from Tuesday night don't inspire much confidence that anything has been fixed at all. In fact, there's a good case to be made that Republicans have gone about breaking it on purpose. According to the AFL-CIO, 16% of Obama voters waited 30 minutes or more in line, compared with just 9% of Romney voters. Also, 9% of white voters waited 30 minutes or more, compared with 22% of black voters and 24% of Hispanic voters. This is a system in which election officials are simply overwhelmed. There are too many stories about insufficient staff or lack of informed poll workers and voting machines. If we are supposed to measure the fitness of our democracy by the simplicity and efficiency of casting a vote, then we are grossly out of shape. Joining me at the table now is Dr. DeForest Soaries, former chairman of the U.S. Election Assistance Commission, current senior pastor of the First Baptist Church of Lincoln Gardens in Somerset, New Jersey. Myrna Perez, senior counsel for the Democracy Program at the Brenner Center for Justice at NYU School of Law. Ben Jealous, returning to the table, president and CEO of an organization you may have heard of, the NAACP. And Bertha Lewis, also returning to the table, former CEO of ACORN, founder and president of the Black Institute, a nonprofit African-American advocacy group. It's great to have you all here.
Thank you.
DeForest, you and I, we were just talking. I interviewed you. I was doing a story about election administration in the run-up to 2004, and the title of the article was, "Can There Be Another Florida?"
Right.
And what it was looking at is the history of the Help America Vote Act. Take us through the Help America Vote Act and what your role was. You were the head of the Election Assistance Commission, which was the body created by HAVA that was supposed to fix the way we run elections in this country. What happened?
You have 3 hours? Or in 2000, we had the Florida debacle. What most people don't know about 2000 was that in Georgia, more votes were lost than in Florida.
Wow.
But Florida was the focus because the election was close, and Florida determined the outcome. After Florida, the consensus in Congress was we had to do something about voting. Now, we have to be careful not to talk about fixing elections. Mm-hmm. There's a difference between fixing elections and fixing voting.
Right, yeah.
And the consensus was that we would repair the voting process, that the hanging chad and those types of devices were antiquated and they were inaccessible. And so Congress passed a law in 2002 called the Help America Vote Act that funded states to buy new equipment, that set up national standards for voting equipment, that made overseas voting easier for military personnel especially, that looked at mobilizing college students to become poll workers, a number of things. And it set up a commission, a bipartisan, presidentially appointed, Senate-confirmed commission that needed 3 votes to make a decision on anything. And I became the first chairman of that commission. The commission was to have been formed 120 days after the law was passed. The commission was formed 2 years after the law was passed. and 2 years after was the next presidential election. And so the commission did not take office until January of 2004. Now, what can a commission do?
In 10 months before an election.
Right. The commission was supposed to have been funded. It was authorized for a $10 million budget. It was appropriated to have $1.2 million. $1.2 million to run a presidential commission to oversee the presidential election. $800,000 of that $1.2 million, by the way, by law, had to be spent to publish the state's plans for using their appropriations in the congressional record.
So you really got $400,000 in the entire federal budget to run an election assistance commission.
That's salaries of 4 commissioners, an executive director, rent. There was no office. We literally camped out at the Federal Elections Commission for 4 months. We begged the White House and the Congress for staff. It was horrendous. At the same time, however, there was pressure put on us to comply with the timetables of the law for dispersing $2.3 million. I'm probably the only black man that spent $2.3 million of federal money in 6 months. we were proven checks because I went to Congress.
$2.3 billion, right? Billion, yeah.
I went to the Congress and said, listen, it doesn't make sense for the federal government to fund states to buy new voting equipment prior to having standards for that voting equipment.
Okay, so
we bought $2 billion worth of voting equipment without any standards to say how the equipment should
Exactly.
operate.
So what ended up happening was money gets pushed out the door, lots of contracts with voting machine companies. It looked like it was a little bit of a boondoggle for them because one of the people who sponsored the bill was the notorious Bob Ney of Ohio, later went to prison involved in the Abramoff scandal.
Right.
Abramoff himself was a lobbyist on behalf of some of the voting machine companies.
It was a debacle. It was theater. It was designed to send money out and look like we were repairing the system when in fact we made it worse.
And you walked away.
I walked away. After the November 2004 election, I resigned because I could not participate in a process where neither the White House nor the Congress was serious about the mission. What I concluded, Chris, was that after the 2000 debacle, the elected officials all concluded that the process can't be that bad, notwithstanding hanging chads, because it produced them.
Right.
So any process that produces them doesn't need to be repaired.
Well, that is a case. Yeah.
Right.
Well, there was an important function, though, of the EAC that I think is relevant to the discussion that we're having today, and that was as a national clearinghouse of information. And so one of the things we have all been talking about are the long lines in New York because of the voting machines breaking down. Yeah. Those voting machines broke down in California, the same ones, the same optical scanners, and had there been some way of a federal agency allowing for people to disseminate information to show what other vendors and what other election officials are experiencing, we could have election workers that are better trained to be able to fix the problems that confront them.
The Election Assistance Commission has 4 commissioners, right? 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats. It currently has 0 commissioners. 0 of its commissioners are working.
Which means it can't decide anything
defunct
about anything.
How are we going to fix this? That's going to happen right after this break. All right, so before we talk about how we're going to fix this system, fix the problem, can we just talk about the problem first, right? You see lines of voters around the country, and I myself went into the public school in Park Slope where I live, and it took an hour and a half to vote. And I don't think that was because people were trying to suppress the Park Slope vote in New York City. It just seemed like the system itself was overwhelmed and inefficient. When we look at the lines of voters, what are the different reasons that there are lines of voters?
Well, first of all, you have bad equipment. I know we talked about the commission actually being able to fund equipment. Now, in my neighborhood and in the neighborhoods of people that I organize, our equipment always was bad. Right. So it just got a little marginally better with, a scanner. But, there's no coincidence that these things break down. The other thing is not to be able to anticipate turnout. You knew what the turnout was in 2008. And in this country, you can't figure out what the turnout is going to be and how you're going to
accommodate it. They should hire Nate Silver for every...
We plan for low turnout.
That's right. For me, it's either you revere and respect voting and the electoral process based on what you do and how you proceed. But as you said, Chris, what this shows is there is no respect and no reverence for this constitutional right to vote.
Ben.
But you know what happens here in New York City in some boroughs actually is more relevant, more representative of what happens in the Deep South than most folks realize.
Exactly. Yeah, that's the point.
We have boroughs that are included in Section 5.
Yes, right.
Because there's because this
parts
state,
of Brooklyn are in Section 5.
Exactly. Because this state has a very deep history of suppressing the black vote, goes back to right after the Civil War.
Right.
That's ultimately why we have long lines. You saw it from the AFL study. And in fact, if you split that north-south, if you looked into states in the former you would see that the white vote is much easier and the black vote is much harder. We kind of bake in these sort of inefficiencies as a way of suppressing the vote. I mean, that's absolutely clear. What we have to do...
Before you get to that, convince me that's the case. Convince me this is not... When you say... Now, I am convinced about, when Republicans come in and they're like, oh, let's get rid of early voting. Let's have voter ID. I'm convinced that that's about suppressing the vote of constituencies that are not going to vote Republican. Tend to be black and Latino youth, right? But when you talk about, we have a crappy system that's got a lot of choke points in it, convince me that is about...
Because our system really isn't one system. Let's be clear on that.
Yeah.
It is a system that's first all 50 states, and then it's every county. And then the person who's in charge of it in that county is from the dominant party in that county.
Exactly.
And so if you're down south, or if you're in some boroughs in the city,
this is the key point.
This is a party boss who's saying, make sure that those folks, those voters have a hard time, make sure our folks have an easy time.
That's the whole point.
It's that simple.
It's radically decentralized system.
The history of voting,
and therefore radically politicized.
The history of voting in this country has been this. The party that benefits from expanding the franchise is for expanding the franchise. Whether it's lowering the voting age, whether it's expanding to blacks and women, that's the system. And as long as voting, which is a democratic right, is left to politics, which is an enterprise, then we're in trouble. On Election Day, the only people who are interested in turnout are the people running campaigns. And as long as the government allows the political process to control the constitutional right, then we have an inherent de facto voter suppression reality.
This decentralization, I think, is just really key for people to understand. So I just want to linger on it for 1 second, which is there are no national standards. Zero. I mean, there are. The HAVA has some. There's some sort of benchmarks you have to hit, but
voluntary standards.
Voluntary standards. There's no. You can if you
Which,
could.
By the way, in Mississippi, a voluntary federal standard is no standard.
That's right.
I mean, you could say we're going to have votes by you got to fold a piece of origami or something. I mean, you'd have a constitutional challenge to that.
Our foreign policy, and this is why this is so critical. Our foreign policy is we promote democracy. We judge you whether we're going to give you aid or military weapons or have relations with you by how well you allow your citizens to vote and look at us.
Well, Chris, I mean, it's clear that part of the long lines had to do with poor election administration, right? We had poll workers who weren't trained. We had machines that weren't working. We had bad election preparedness. But I very much believe that the long lines were also a result of what we saw was a war on voting.
Exactly.
We had 25 restrictive laws being passed, 2 executive actions in 19 states, and those remnants affected us today. And I can explain this because so in Ohio and Florida we had really long lines. Well, some of the laws that they passed compressed early voting. So if you have less time
squeezing the balloon, if you get less people here, then you're going to have a bulge over there.
But also, there created enormous confusion because there were challenges to this war on voting. In Pennsylvania, we kept hearing people call into the election protection hotline saying they're turning me away because I don't have voter ID. We know that the voter ID wasn't implemented for this particular election. But that didn't mean that the message didn't somehow get to some poll workers. And that happened everywhere. In New Jersey, which is where I live, they do not have a photo identification law. And people were calling in saying they're asking me to show my ID. I didn't have it. So when you have a war on voting like what we saw, it creates a confusion even when we win. We won the war. We won the war on voting.
Well, no. We won a battle. This war on voting is going to continue for years. And we've got to be very clear about that.
Well, particularly in the wake of Supreme Court case, which is going to
But let me speak to Bertha's point.
Yeah.
I went to Vienna to represent our country at an international conference on democracy, and voting was the issue.
Must have been the punchline of every joke.
And listen, and the Europeans pulled me aside and said this. They said, listen, how is it that all of us open up our voting process on Election Day to international observers, starting with the U.S., and the U.S. will not allow international observers to come here to observe the voting?
We actually went over to the UN Human Rights Commission, got them to send over folks here to about 40 states. They threw them out of 4 states because we are embarrassed about the state of our democracy.
Last night at 11 p.m., I was literally in bed reading that UN report, the preliminary report, and it was so funny to read about the U.S. from like this sort of anthropological perspective, like in this country they have a fairly free press, and it was like, oh yeah, these are the deficiencies of our system. We talked a lot about the deficiencies. I want to sort of start moving towards solutions because I think we can. This is fixable. This is a nation of smart people with a lot of resources.
You have to know the history.
Yes, but let's talk about solutions right after this. We're talking about the American system of election administration and the long lines for voting. I want to give a pretty amazing statistic. Just voter turnout, right? I mean, we lose sight on election day that there's about 40 or 50 million people who aren't even registered, who are eligible and not even registered on the day when voting happens. Here's voter turnout of the eligible populace in 169 countries. The U.S. ranked next to last among G8 nations. So we come in at 120 out of 169 and next to last out of G8. Now, one interesting and important thing about this, I would note, is that voter turnout does not mean you have a really great functioning democracy, as evidenced by Italy coming in number one on that list. So we shouldn't kid ourselves that this is like the panacea to fixing everything.
Get Berlusconi.
Right, exactly. So, but I do think it's remarkable to see that. Myrna, you made a point to me about voter registration, because when we talk about solutions, we should start going all the way upstream. Right?
Definitely.
Let's start with the population of people that are eligible to vote, which is people that are citizens over 18 who have not been disenfranchised by local felony disenfranchisement laws, and people that have green cards too, right? You can vote if you have a green card?
People that are U.S. citizens.
Just U.S. citizens, okay. That group of folks, how do we get them to the polls?
I'm glad you asked. There is one of the big problems with our system is that we rely on antiquated paper to get people registered. Imagine what that is. You go to the DMV to get your driver's license. You fill out a form that says, I want to register to vote. That form has to get mailed to the election office. The election office has to type it in. Hopefully they didn't mistype your name. The better way to do it is to put the burden on the government to try and register voters. And the way you do it is by leveraging existing technology. There are computers at the DMV. They can talk directly to the Board of Election Administration. That's the same for our social service agencies. That's the same for our colleges. And once you do that, you could have a very good list of who is registered to vote. You give people the opt-out, the opportunity to opt out if they decide they don't want to participate. But then you have someone that's already on the rolls. I can't tell you how many people on Election Day called into the Election Protection Hotline that said, I didn't show up on the rolls.
So what you're saying is, rather than it being the burden being on the citizen to go out and affirmatively do something to add themselves to the rolls, the burden on the government to go out and affirmatively add that citizen to the rolls, and you can obviously decline if you don't want to.
You can obviously decline.
And I always think about this. When I turned 18 in New York City, as senior in high school, my selective service card showed up. The government knew where I was. They knew where I was. They knew where my address is. It wasn't magic.
Why not have that?
You know why? Because there's nobody in charge. You can have all the solutions you want. In New Jersey, we have an independent commission for gambling and have no commission for voting.
Yes.
I mean, we're more concerned about slot machines than we are voting machines.
Absolutely.
No, that's right. And the key thing here is that this is what every other major Western democracy does.
Right.
I mean, we should worry as a country when we're a punchline for Russia.
Right.
I'm saying when Russia looks at our democracy and says, wow, that's inefficient. Wow, it's got a lot of flaws, because we're supposed to be the best, and we were the best in 1776. But we got to update.
Right.
And part of that updating means now we all but one, have computerized voter registration databases statewide. So why
which was part of the Help America Vote Act mandated that.
That's exactly right. So why is it that when you move from one county to the other, if you didn't re-register, you're not on the rolls? They find you in the system, so they know that you're there.
Yeah, this always always drives me nuts. It's like everybody in my world, like my friends, the post office, bill collectors, my magazine subscriptions, they all know where I am. How does the voting system not?
And be very clear. We at the association have a 50-state database of every voter. We know who is registered and who is not registered.
Right. You can purchase access to that.
It's the same database that the folks who send you those catalogs use.
Exactly.
So the federal government could use it and fix it like that.
That's right.
But the federal government will not.
Why won't they? Yeah, explain to us.
Because our infrastructure is based on that 1776 model that Ben talked about, where the states, it's the United States of America, not the United States of America.
Right.
And so states' rights in this issue has the final word. And today we have more mobility, more diversity, more technology. In 1776, you couldn't vote in Massachusetts in the morning, New Jersey in the afternoon, and Florida in the evening. But this is the 21st century.
The resistance there is very deep. About 15 years ago when I moved to Mississippi, I was told that if I wanted to vote in the federal race, I could sign up at the DMV.
Right.
But if I wanted to vote in the, for dog catcher, I had to go across the town to the courthouse.
That's right. That's right.
And so now this year, our folks go out there. We've fixed that problem, by the way.
Right.
Our folks go out there, and what do they decide to do? They decide just to not process the voter registrations, and there's thousands of them sitting on the clerk's desk in Hinds County right now.
And this is exactly right.
That's exactly right.
First of all, there should be no third-party registration. It should be the role of the government to register its citizens. It should be automatic. It should be universal. We have to have the will to do this. To me, the election day has to be a national holiday, period. If I could celebrate some president's birthday, I certainly ought to be able to celebrate the constitutional right to vote.
Well,
we also
be real clear, Bertha, that when somebody stands in line for 8 hours and misses an entire day of work, that is a poll tax.
Well,
that's exactly right.
Absolutely.
In terms of thinking about what we can do, there is a federal legislation that would modernize our elections for federal elections. It's a Voter Empowerment Act. It was sponsored by John Lewis, the great hero. It does other things like restore voting rights to persons with criminal convictions.
Hold that thought. I want to talk about the Voter Empowerment Act, and then I also want to talk about even broader, like voting in different ways, vote by mail, moving it to Saturday, how we can just get it all so that people are maximally participating in the system after this. I just want to note that the state of Florida has still not been called. We were expecting at some point today, I think, but they said before.
If we had early voting, it probably would have been.
Right, exactly. If they had early voting. And Rick Scott did a whole lot in that state to squeeze that system, a lot of...
Seriously, this is the most powerful nation on this earth. Seriously.
I know. Well, hopefully by noon today.
Again.
But let's be clear, because this really shows what we were talking about. Rick's whole purpose was to re-break stuff other people had fixed.
Yes, right. Florida was the laughingstock of the nation, and they really did, as far as I could tell, revamp their system. They got rid of the hanging chads, all this stuff. They re-enfranchised They had the harshest felony disenfranchisement laws, I think, in the entire country.
And then they rolled it back.
They re-franchised them, and then they got disenfranchised again.
They re-disenfranchised.
Right. They re-disenfranchised.
Who does that in a democracy?
So Myrna, tell me a little bit about the Voter Empowerment Act, which John Lewis has written, and broadly how we can expand the franchise.
Okay, well, the Voter Empowerment Act consists of a number of components. It has an Anti-Deceptive Practice Act component. It restores voting rights to persons with criminal convictions upon release from prison in federal elections. But it also modernizes our registration system. It makes it such that the burden is on the government to register people. It uses modern technology to transmit information such that registration is automatic. It makes your voter registration portable within the state so that if you move from one county to the other. Great. It has online components so that you can look up to see if your name is spelled right, and it has an election day correction in the event that something goes wrong on election day. You can present identification that shows.
I love this legislation.
No, it's a great piece of legislation. We should work really hard to get it passed.
And frankly, this is very conservative, small c. I mean, this is just about doing things right.
Like Harvard was.
Right.
The problem is enforcement.
Well, and it's
Who is going to make this happen? What are the penalties when it doesn't happen? What are the best practices? What commission? If EAC is not the commission, someone. I don't believe government can do everything.
Right.
But in this instance, government must enforce, and government must pay for it. And we still don't have a prototype voting machine that creates the standard for what an effective voting machine should look like.
But the nice thing about at least the voter registration component part is that it pays for itself. It's very expensive to mail paper forms, to type them in. When the computers are talking to each other electronically,
you're actually saving money.
Money.
The key point here, and I think this is such an interesting point when we talk about this issue, because there's a technical aspect to this and a policy issue, and what I keep hearing from you, DeForest, is that it is fundamentally a question of politics and political will.
It
right?
is.
That we can talk about how if we washed away the politics of this, if we washed away the fact that the way the American political coalitions work at this moment is that one party benefits from a restricted turnout and the other party benefits from a large turnout, then we could fix the system. But the fundamental political fact of American politics in this moment is that political fact, that asymmetry, right?
To be clear, when you don't have the EAC working, what you have is the DNC and the RNC.
Exactly.
And the RNC has decided that that's to their advantage.
That's my point.
My thanks to Dr. DeForest Soaries, former chairman of the U.S. Election Assistance Commission. It was really great to hear your story today. I think that's been lost to history, and I'm glad to have you here at the table to tell it. Myrna Perez from the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU School of Law, Ben Jealous from the NAACP, and Bertha Lewis, former CEO of Acorn. Thanks for getting up. Thanks for coming. And let's remember, Voter Empowerment Act. We're going to keep on that. A final thought on the election when we come back. In just a moment, a final thought on the election. But first, a quick personal update. Tomorrow, Monday, November 12th at 8 p.m., I'll be appearing at the Miami Book Fair International at Miami-Dade College in Miami, Florida, to talk about my book, Twilight of the Elites. And the next day, Tuesday, November 13th at 7 p.m., I'll be appearing at MIT in Boston, where I'll be talking about my book and the election with Ta-Nehisi Coates of The Atlantic Magazine, who is just here today. Today's show was only a preview. For more information on both these events, go to our Facebook page, facebook.com/upwithchris. So I want to finish today's program with a final thought on the election. On Tuesday night, after the race had been called for President Obama, the first call I made was to my brother Luke. When I got married in July of 2007, Luke had to take a few days off his new job as an Obama campaign field organizer in Nevada to attend the wedding. That was more than 5 years ago. And in the intervening 64 months, my brother has spent every single day working for the Obama campaign and its sister organization, Organizing for America. He's worked in 8 states, at times literally living out of clothes in trash bags while putting 87,000 miles on a beat-up old white Ford pickup truck. 60 to 90 hours a week, 52 weeks a year for 5 years, my brother worked to get Barack Obama elected, and then from his perch as the Nevada state director this time around to get him reelected. I'm biased, of course, but to me, Tuesday's victory was Luke's victory as much as it was anyone else's. Luke and the thousands like him, organizers of every hue and background and creed in states across the union, working preposterously long hours, doing the grueling, sometimes comically mundane labor of making democracy work, calling people, knocking on doors, sending emails, sitting through endless meetings and conference calls and sorting columns on spreadsheets and buying office supplies in bulk or slightly used so as to come in under budget, negotiating leases for field offices, getting yelled at by disgruntled volunteers, getting yelled at by stressed out bosses, getting yelled at by diva-esque local political officials. There were thousands of people across the country like my brother doing this work. And not just for OFA, for local candidates from city council on up, for the amazing, successful, historic progressive ballot initiatives that passed across the country, giving us the first popular victories for marriage equality in 3 states and a beginning to the end of our insane policy of marijuana prohibition. When the victory bell rings, we all rush to talk about the great men of history who made it so, the candidates and the master strategists who ran their campaigns, where we point to the exit polling demographics and say it was destiny, fated, inevitable. But nothing in politics is inevitable. And progress only comes about because of the tireless labor of organizers who never get to give speeches at podiums, who don't get vacation home money like the brand name strategists, and who don't show up on cable news unless they're in the background of a photo op. The reward they do get is the fulfillment of the soul that comes from struggle. And the defeat and boredom that are inevitably part of that struggle makes the rare moments of victory that much sweeter. If you want to see what that looks like, check out this video from election night of Richard Carbom of Minnesotans United for All Families, the group that fought the anti-marriage equality ballot initiative in that state. 1:45 a.m., he addressed organizers and volunteers to tell them it was going to be too close to call and to go home and sleep and feel proud about the work they did, win or lose. And then communications director Kelly Schwinghammer announces the AP has called the race.
I couldn't be more proud to have been in a position to lead you guys for the last over a year, and I can't thank you enough for all your hard work and dedication. It's blown my mind every time that I feel like we're just about to hit a wall. You guys blow right through that wall to make this a reality, and so I want you to go to bed tonight. I'm going to be very, very proud of the result we have.
Hey, Richard. The AP.
Unless you've done the work that the people in that room have done, you can't know how that feels. So to all the people in that room and around the country and all the unsung thousands who toiled in the trenches of democracy, a toast. Thank you for what you did. Thank you for what you do. Especially you, Luke. I'm proud of you. And thank you for joining us today for Up. Join us tomorrow, Sunday morning at 8, when we'll have newly re-elected Senator Sherrod Brown and Congressman-elect Hakeem Jeffries. Coming up next is Melissa Harris Perry on today's MHP, The Process President. Is President Obama more about the democratic process than the Democrats' agenda? Also, education reform moving forward. Melissa's special guest, which you are going to want to see, is Randy Weingarten, president of the American Federation of Teachers. That's Melissa Harris Perry. It's going to be a great show. We'll see you right here tomorrow at 8. Thanks for watching today. I really appreciate it. Thanks for getting up.